Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The World Turned Upside Down, America, China, and the Struggle for Global Leadership, by Clyde Prestowitz. Narrated by Paul Heitsch. Introduction. When the facts change, I change my opinion. And what do you do, sir? John Maynard Keynes. In 1991, having emerged triumphant from the Cold War, America and the free world countries experienced a wave of euphoria. The classic expression of the era's geopolitical mood was Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man, which reported that the conquest of the world by democracy and free market capitalism was irresistible and permanent. China did not appear to be an exception. It was still ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and thus continued to call itself a communist country. But the CCP was led by the pragmatic Deng Xiaoping, who famously commented that it matters not whether a cat is black or white so long as it catches mice. True, Deng had ordered the massacre of hundreds and perhaps thousands of students and workers demonstrating for democracy in Beijing's Tiananmen Square and throughout the country on June 4 to 5, 1989. An estimate from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing put the number of deaths at 500 to 2,600. Most casualties were reported to have occurred on Chang'an Avenue outside the square. But he assured global leaders that this was just domestic politics, and it should in no way deter them from taking advantage of China's ultra-low wages by using it as a production location from which to export to world markets and to selling into the growing China market. One of the first to do so was Robert Galvin, the CEO and chairman of Motorola and the son of its founder. He once told me that the Tiananmen Square incident had created a great opportunity for his company. The Chinese, he said, desperately needed investment and technology, and because of all the bad press, they were willing to make significant concessions to attract foreign companies. He hurried to Beijing, where he offered to put Motorola factories in China on the condition that Motorola retain 100% ownership of the business. Standard Chinese policy had been to require joint ventures with Chinese partners, but as Galvin had anticipated, Deng and Company made an exception for Motorola, which hastened to begin offshoring its production from the United States to China. Other U.S. and global CEOs soon followed suit. Nor was there any pushback from Western governments. Quite the opposite. President William Clinton called for engagement. Regarding China's possible censorship of the then new Internet, Clinton scoffed that would be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. In this, he was supported by U.S. Trade Representative Charlene Barshevsky, who said it was a no-brainer that the Internet would lead to China's liberalization. The government is not going to be able to control content. It is not going to be able to control access. The net is going to have the single most profound change on China, engendering tremendous pressure on the Chinese leadership. In 2001, the U.S. government backed China's entrance into the World Trade Organization, WTO. A key argument in favor of this move was that the greatest potential danger to the world would not be a rapidly developing China, but rather an economically failing China. This kind of reassessment was often followed by another, expressed by former Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick, who asserted that the United States and its allies wanted China to be a responsible stakeholder in the global system. I was reminded of this when my chief research assistant, Joel Fischel, was tardy in responding to my request for information during his tour of southern China in the spring of 2019. When he finally emailed me from Manila, he began, "I wanted to write a version of this email to you while I was in China, but I was nervous about doing so. I self-censored myself for fear of writing anything critical of China while I was in the country. Maybe this is paranoid, but that's what I was thinking. Although the likelihood of being detained while in China for writing this was low, it was high enough, in my considered opinion, to prevent me from doing it." A Mandarin speaker with 25 years' experience living in Asia, 20 of them as a U.S. commercial diplomat, including 5 years in Beijing and Shanghai and 6 years in Hong Kong and Taipei. Fischel added that the CCP has succeeded in teaching 1.4 billion Chinese people, 1/5 of humanity, an alternate version of history by creating an alternate internet and establishing an alternate to the reality seen by the rest of the world. The Chinese people, he wrote, can only get the facts that are approved by the CCP. Few, if any, young people have any knowledge of the Tiananmen Square incident. Few are aware of the true nature of the re-education camps established for the Muslim Uyghur people in Xinjiang province, or that the CCP has virtually succeeded in wiping out the entire Tibetan culture. The most frightening thing is their ability to spread and sell their authoritarian model of government not just to other dictators and oppressive regimes, but to countries such as Thailand and Ecuador, who like the idea of security cameras, facial recognition software, etc., to help maintain political power. China, slowly but surely, is reordering some parts of the world in its own image. When China joined the WTO in December 2001, it was an authoritarian state with an $80 billion trade surplus, technically a current account surplus, with the United States, and a $1.3 trillion annual GDP. This was a bit more than 1/10 the U.S. GDP of $10.5 trillion. The United States was the world leader in a wide variety of high-technology industries like telecommunications, avionics, and semiconductors, while China was concentrating on producing shoes, textiles, steel, and concrete. Top U.S. officials like U.S. Trade Representative Barshevsky and Commerce Secretary Mickey Cantor told Congress that admitting China to the WTO would cut the U.S. trade deficit in half because China's high tariffs would be greatly reduced, while the low U.S. tariffs wouldn't change. In other words, it seemed China was making all the concessions. The result, they said, would be millions of new, high-paying U.S. jobs. Over the next 20 years, that forecast proved embarrassingly false. The U.S. trade deficit with China hit nearly $400 billion in 2018 and was accompanied by the loss of 5 million jobs. Indicative of what was happening was the example of General Electric's avionics division. In November 2009, GE announced it was merging this division into a joint venture with the Chinese state-owned Aviation Industry Corporation, AVIC, and moving operations to a headquarters in Shanghai. At first blush, this seemed like a strange decision on 2 counts. First, avionics are not a labor-intensive product, and China had no previous avionics production experience. This was the kind of product that economists said should be made in capital and technology-rich countries like the United States, rather than in low-wage countries like China, because very few worker hours were necessary to make avionics products. Second, GE's CEO and chairman Jeff Immelt was also, at that time, the chairman of President Obama's Commission on Jobs and Competitiveness. It seemed odd that a person in that capacity would want to be seen sending high-tech, high-paying jobs out of the United States. But there was a method to this madness. In the 8 years since 2001, China's GDP had quadrupled. Demand for air travel was soaring, and China had decided to develop its own aircraft industry. The Chinese government and the CCP had made it clear to Immelt that he'd have a better chance of selling avionics in China if GE made them in China. This was, of course, contrary to the dominant neoclassical free trade theory, to the rules of the WTO, and to the expectations of Anglo-American economists, journalists, and trade officials, but it was easily understood by those who had watched Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore get rich. They had done so through industrial policies that protected and subsidized investment aimed at developing indigenous capacity in industries characterized by economies of scale and rapid technological advances in the context of potentially large export markets. In June 2012, China seized
Sample complete. Ready to continue?